This is the second presentation for Chapter 7. We're going to continue talking about language, and in this segment we'll talk about how languages are systematized, analyzed, and studied, and that involves linguistics. We'll be introducing some concepts that are not in the chapter. The textbook talks about a few aspects of linguistics. We're going to go a little further than that. We're going to start by looking just at a simple sentence in English. The dog is biting the man. And we can look at that sentence from a variety of perspectives. One is, well, we can analyze the language that it represents, which is English, one of over 6,000 languages. It's hard to have an exact count of languages. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next presentation. Is English typical of languages? Well, yes and no. It's a spoken language, but it's also a written language. Not all languages are written. In fact, the minority of languages have a written form. In terms of its writing system, it's typical of a lot of languages that use the Latin alphabet, but certainly not all languages do. And there are languages like Arabic or Russian that use different writing systems. Mandarin, you see the same sentence, the dog is biting the man, in Chinese. And you see that, in fact, the symbols there are quite different from what the English alphabet looks like. We can do a linguistic analysis of the sentence. We can look at the pronunciation. The dog is biting the man. I'm using fairly standard American pronunciation. If somebody was reading that who lived in Australia or in Great Britain, it would sound quite different. And one of the things that linguistics does is analyze sounds, the sounds of languages. So phonetics is the study of those sounds, how those sounds are made. In other words, how you shape your mouth, how the vocal cords make those sounds. And phonology is the use of those sounds in terms of a specific language. One of the essential tools in phonetics and phonology is something called the International Phonetic Alphabet. And you see our sentence represented there, the dog is biting the man. Looks quite different in IPA, in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Another aspect of linguistics is semantics, what the sentence means. And in this case, the sentence is quite clear. It's not the man biting the dog, but the dog biting the man, and it's unambiguous. We can talk about how a sentence is put together, and that's syntax. And so in English, very often we start with the subject, in this case the dog. He's doing the action that the verb describes, to bite in this case. And we can talk about the object, the direct object of the action described by that verb, which is the man. And so we can talk about the fact that in English typically you have SVO, word order, subject, verb, and object. That's not, however, how all languages are put together in terms of sentences. In German, for example, that same sentence might very well be rendered this way: Den Mann beißt der Hund. It has the same meaning, the dog is biting the man, but it starts with a direct object, the man, den Mann. And after the verb, beißen, you have the subject, der Hund. The meaning is the same, the word order is different. The emphasis is placed more on who is being bitten. That's what the effect of putting the object first instead of the subject. But it's quite unambiguous a sentence as well. Namely, it's very clear in the German sentence who is doing the biting. And how can we tell? Well, we can tell by morphology. Morphology is how endings are used in languages. So if you look at the German sentence, den Mann, der Hund, both of those are masculine nouns, and you have different versions of the definite article the. In the case of man, you have den man. That's because it's used as a direct object and is therefore accusative case. Case of Hund, that's the subject, therefore nominative case, and therefore the form of the definite article the is der and not den. So German uses those endings to indicate how those nouns are used. English tends to use word order. So we know the dog is biting the man. We know who's doing the biting by the fact the dog comes first and not the man. So these are some of the aspects of linguistics that we're going to be looking at in this presentation. But first, let's look a little bit at the field of linguistics and how it's evolved. Linguistics started with talking about languages, particularly ancient languages, Greek and Latin, and other old languages in the 18th and 19th centuries. You see a picture there of one of the Grimm brothers. I think that's Jakob Grimm, who were pioneers in the study of languages. Language study changed significantly in the early 20th century, largely under the influence of linguist Ferdinand de Saussure from France. I think it was from France. Was it from Belgium? I think it was French. Who introduced what's today called descriptive linguistics. In contrast to historical linguistics, where the emphasis was on how languages changed over time, with Saussure, what he was interested in was analyzing the nature of language as it's used in the present day. He was also the father of the field of semiotics, which is the study of signs. There's also transformational linguistics, which the influential linguist here is Noam Chomsky, who we've encountered in a couple of the video clips. He was very influential in the field of linguistics, and we're going to be talking about some of the most important ideas that come from Chomsky. Different aspects of linguistics that may be of interest. Sociolinguistics, the interface between language and culture and society, obviously is something that is of interest from the perspective of this course. Field linguistics is actually a subfield of anthropology. These are linguists who go out into cultures that haven't been studied very much and study their language, try to create grammars and dictionaries of languages that haven't been studied. Applied linguistics, that's the field that I do research in. It deals with language acquisition, how language is learned, language learning, and also language learning and technology. And technology is also part of what's called computational linguistics. That's a important field today because one of the things that it involves is natural language processing. That is to say, recognizing a machine or software, recognizing what not only when people are speaking, but what they're saying, and also being able to respond to verbal prompts. There's the famous case of the iPhone, which has a processor called Siri, which can understand a variety of languages and has a synthetic voice that responds as well. That's part of computational linguistics. We're going to look at descriptive linguistics in particularly, and we're going to start by watching this short clip from the Human Language series that talks about linguistics and how languages are analyzed. So let's go ahead and watch that clip.
There was a tremendous change in the research program for linguistics right around the turn of the 20th century. And the leading figure in this change was a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure thought of languages very much like chess games, that each language has a set of pieces, namely the building blocks of the language, the words, the sounds, and they were put together by different rules. Different languages, of course, have different rules. Interestingly, Saussure discovered every language has rules. There are no languages that are so primitive, for example, that they don't have any rules at all.
There's no such thing as a primitive language, or a primitive people for that matter.
And that was an important discovery. Because before the beginning of the 20th century, people talked freely about primitive languages. What Saussure and the people who worked around him said was, oh, no, every language has rules.
Every language? Everywhere? In the Bering Sea on St. Lawrence Island is one of the last holdouts of a language called Siberian Yupik Eskimo, once thought to have complex rules completely different from other languages. Yet, examined carefully, even Eskimo turns out to be less different than it sounds. One scholar of the language is a native of the island, Darlene Orr.
The people here on St. Lawrence Island speak Siberian Yupik, and it is also spoken on the other side, and that's in the Siberian part. It's the only indigenous language to the Old World and to the New, spoken by non-colonial peoples.
One language, the verb might go in one place. In another language, the sound might pattern this way, but in another language in a different way. But every language has rules.
And that means, were you trying to call him?
There are two major ground plans, two great options in building a language. Relying on the order of words to convey the meaning of your overall thought, or changing the endings of the words one by one and then shuffling them around.
The reason this word looks so long is because Siberian Yupik Eskimo relies heavily on suffixation, using suffixes in a word. There are no prefixes or infixes in Siberian Yupik, and linguists speculate that this is probably the most inflected language in the world, which means that it could have multitudes of suffixes for endings. This part means being acted upon. This much here means without, and the last part means us. So the whole word means without us being sprayed upon by water when you're traveling in a boat.
There are a couple of things here that are should be noted. The first is that we assume in linguistics that languages have rules, that those rules can be identified. That's one of the things that linguists do, that field linguists do, for example, with new languages, and that those languages can be described, that rules can be established. Descriptive linguistics is not prescriptive linguistics. Prescriptive linguistics has to deal with rules that should be followed. In other words, talking about language use in society today and use of expressions that are not standard for the language. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later on. That's part of sociolinguistics. But what we're going to be looking at very briefly are the major different areas of descriptive linguistics. So let's go ahead and look at the first of those, which is phonetics or phonology. And this is the rules for how sounds are put together to create meaning, initially putting together to make syllables and then words. And so there are rules for how that's done depending on the language. So, for example, in English, there are a limited number of what are called phonemes, which are the smallest unit of sound that are used in the English language. Other languages have different numbers of phonemes. For example, Chinese has a very restricted number of phonemes. That's why there's so many sounds, so many words that sound alike, but have different tones. Obviously, getting the sounds right is important if you're learning another language. It's one of the difficulties, in fact, in learning another language, particularly later in life. One of the things that can be helpful is learning the basics of the International Phonetic Alphabet. If you look up a word in a decent dictionary, you often will see after the word, the listing of the word, you'll see in brackets often the pronunciation indicated. And this is used internationally for all languages, including languages that have very different sounds from English. And you see the symbols there for some representative sounds in English. Some of the symbols look like the way that sound is spelled typically in English. So the p sound for pen, for example, is just a p. The k sound for cat is a k. So nothing unexpected there. But then we have different kinds of sounds, like the th sound, which is a hard sound for people who are not native speakers of English. We have other sounds like the ny sound, like ringer, the sound, sing, that's also has that sound. This another kind of tricky sound for people who are learning English. Next, we're going to talk about morphology. Morphology is not something that's limited to linguistics. In zoology, for example, you might talk about different parts of an insect and how those change from insect to insect. So you identify the different parts and then talk about how they're distinctive in a particular sample, particular unit. What we're talking about in terms of language is the smallest possible unit of meaning, which is a morpheme. And so we'll see some examples of what are meant by morphemes. We saw before that there are 45 phonemes in English. Remember, that's the smallest possible unit of sound. And those generate a number of different possible morphemes. And let's look at an example. You have the word comfort. Well, come and fort by themselves, in the sense that they're used in that word, don't have any separate meaning. So we can say that the word comfort has just one morpheme. But if we add ed, we're changing the meaning. We're indicating that's used in the past. And we have, therefore, two morphemes. Comfort is the first, and ed is the second. But we might have this word, in which there are three morphemes, and each has a particular meaning or a particular role in terms of changing the meaning of comfort. So uncomfortable, you have the un, which indicates that it's the opposite, and then the suffix at the end, which makes it into an adjective. Let's look at some morphology from the perspective of children learning language.
You have this one, you have this one, you have this one, you have this one. Everybody got their pictures? What did your person do before they went to school?
They drive to school.
He did what?
They drive.
Drive to school?
Children are designed in such a way to look for rules in the data around them. They're very good at finding rules that are there, and they're very good at even overgeneralizing these rules.
What's going overhead?
Geese.
We find everywhere that children take the irregular patterns of their language and try to make them as regular as possible. So just like English-speaking children will say things like 2 foots instead of 2 feet, or it braked instead of it broke, children in every language will fill in the missing gaps, fill in the errors, and try to make the language follow a system. They have a clear sense of system.
We find that deaf children of deaf parents begin to learn first words and then begin to learn the grammar at the same age as hearing children learning spoken language. And in so doing, we find they make the same kinds of mistakes or overgeneralizations, showing that, in fact, they're extracting out the rules of the language. So if you want to sign, this is duck. If you want to sign 2 ducks, you probably say 2 duck. But a deaf baby instead will overgeneralize and sign 2 ducks like this.
So they're looking for some deep principles. They follow these deep principles. If the language chooses to violate those principles now and then, the children seem to say, so much the worse for the language.
Ruth says that they're foots. I say that they're feet. What do you say they are?
I say they're foots.
It's interesting that the errors that children make in using words and putting endings on words, for example, to indicate plural or to indicate past tense forms, those are not random mistakes. They're based on rules that the children have absorbed from hearing language being used all around them, and they apply these rules systematically. And the exceptions to the rules are something that they have to learn in time. They're not innate, those exceptions, they just have to be learned. How children learn that to manipulate words, I think is a good lesson for language learners, in the sense that children deduce rules from usage patterns. They don't sit down and learn, okay, when you're age 3, your mother doesn't tell you, okay, ED is the ending that you'll use in English to indicate past tense. No. Those are something that you get from absorbing the language. This is the best way, in fact, to learn rules of morphology, in other words, grammar changes in a target language. If you're learning a second language, is by hearing those patterns being used. And it's also the case that children are wonderful at learning language because they're not, they don't have any inhibitions about just going ahead and using the rules, applying rules, and rules might be wrong, but you can still understand if a child says geeses, you'll understand what's meant. And this is important in language learning as well, that you have to learn from your mistakes, and you kind of have to just plunge ahead. Okay, we'll talk about syntax a little bit. Syntax is how words are put together to make sense, to make sentences, and there are rules for that in each language, how that works, and not all languages are the same. English has this kind of typical syntax for a little more complex sentence than the first one we looked at. John has gone to the store to buy some eggs. Okay, let's look at word order in a different language. In German, this might be, John has to the store gone some eggs to buy. Johann ist zum Laden gegangen, Eier zu kaufen. So the word order there is significantly different. We have the verbs in different positions. Other languages are going to have different syntax. So we might have, in fact, in Russian, we might very well have the prepositional phrase at the very beginning of the sentence. But there are rules for that. And let's look a little bit more at syntax in this next clip.
How did sound and meaning ever get linked together? When you think about it, there's really no two things that are more different from each other than sound and meaning. Meaning, the ideas in the brain, to put it in simple terms. Sounds, these things that come out of our lungs and our vocal cords, they're totally different. How did they ever get linked? What biological event could have created this? Well, the biological event was the creation of grammar, syntax. What grammar is a system that allows these mismatched components, sound and meaning, to be linked to each other.
The first task of grammar is to organize words in a line, one after another. An event is about to take place. Will we report it in the order in which things actually happened? Is there a natural order of events? A woman fell from the cable car. We say the woman first, then the cable car. Because the woman came first? But surely the cable car was already there before the woman fell.
It seems evident, if you compare your thoughts and perceptions to the things that you say, that there's a very direct relationship between what you experience and how you talk about it. But in fact, there's a great mystery. Because when we speak, we have to say things one word after another. We have no choice. That's the way language works. But when we see things or experience things, they don't necessarily come bit by bit in a linear order.
The boy kicks the ball. Which comes first in reality? The boy, then the kick, then the ball? This is one of the puzzles of syntax, that the form of a sentence is often independent of its meaning.
Because boy, ball, and kick can occur in any order in language. In perception, they occur simultaneously.
In fact, the order of the words doesn't seem to have anything to do with the order of events.
But we have to arrange it in one way or another in order to speak about it. One of the major tasks of using language is to take something which is essentially atemporal, nonlinear, and to arrange it in linear patterns in order to make different kinds of points.
Does the form of a sentence depend on its meaning?
There's a famous example sentence in linguistics that Chomsky's been talking about since the 50s. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
Colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
Well, a small industry has been spawned by one linguistic example, namely colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which has been the source of poems and arguments and set to music and so on.
Colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
This is a very interesting sentence because it shows that syntax can be separated from semantics, that form can be separated from meaning. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It doesn't seem to mean anything coherent, but it sounds like an English sentence. If you read it back to front, furiously sleep ideas green colorless, that wouldn't sound like English at all.
Colorless green ideas sleep furiously.
Well, that tells us that there's more to what determines the structure of a sentence than whether it has meaning or not.
If you tried out the sentence on a child, I bet the child would giggle. But I suspect that the reaction would be different if you tried out furiously sleep ideas green colorless. You might get a blank stare instead. For a sentence to be a sentence of English in terms of its structure, it doesn't seem to matter much what the words mean or whether they go together in a meaningful way, just that they go together in a way that obeys the rules of syntax.
This is a interesting clip from a variety of perspectives. And there are kind of three things in particular I think that are important. The first is this relationship between thought and speech, which is discussed, thought and language, that that's not a natural thing necessarily, that there's this connection between these symbols, like CAT, that's a symbol for a particular animal, and the thought, the image of that in our brain. This is something that all languages have, but that is not something that's automatic by any means. And when we talk about syntax, in other words, putting together sentences, describing things, going beyond sentences to paragraphs, one of the things that's interesting here is that when we perceive something in reality, we see a lot of things at the same time. When we're describing what we've seen, we can't do that. We have to put words together one after another. And that's what syntax does for us. The other thing I thought that was interesting here is this sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's nonsense, obviously, in terms of its meaning. But in terms of its word order, in terms of its syntax, it's perfectly okay. And this is an indication that syntax is independent of semantics, which is another field of linguistics that we're going to be looking at, study of meanings of words. And this is something that varies from one language to another, obviously, because the words themselves vary, but also because when you take a particular word, it might have multiple meanings. It might have a particular denotation, which is what you find in the dictionary, but it might have different connotations. In other words, it might be used in different ways. And what you see here is a list of some of the issues, concerns in the field of semantics. So we're talking about words, that are similar, words that are used in idiomatic ways, in metaphors, similes. We talk about opposites and similarities in words. One of the areas that I find really interesting in terms of semantics are what are called collocations. Collocations are fixed expressions. In other words, for example, adjectives and nouns that frequently go together, or idiomatic expressions. These are important things in learning languages. You have words that have dictionary meanings, but you have also collocations as they're used in everyday language, how people actually speak and how people put words together. Another field, a couple other fields of semantics, etymology deals with the origins of words. Lexicology deals with creating dictionaries. Pragmatics is the last area of linguistics that we're going to talk about. This is the study of how language is actually used. And I think this is best illustrated by an example. Because what we're talking about here is kind of the cultural or the contextual use of language. And let's look at an example. It's cold. Well, that sentence can have a very clear meaning. For example, if you have this context, what's the weather like today? It's cold. There it's a description of the temperature. But let's look at another example. Do you want to go outside for a walk? No, it's cold. What's the meaning of it's cold there? Well, it's a reply to the question, you want to go out for a walk. In other words, it means no. It's not what I want to do. Here's another example. You're in a room. Somebody opens the window to get some fresh air, and you say, hey, it's cold. Well, what's the meaning of it's cold there? Well, the pragmatic meaning is not that you're giving somebody the information about the temperature. That person already knows that. What you're saying, in effect, with it's cold is close the window. What are you doing opening the window when it's cold outside? So that's what's meant by pragmatics. In other words, going beyond kind of the dictionary meaning of words and expressions and looking at how words are actually used and expressions are actually used. So this is really a field of sociolinguistics. Okay, let's talk about some particular issues related to modern linguistics that derive from Noam Chomsky. The first of these is the concept of universal grammar. This is discussed in the textbook, so I'll just mention that this is something that is widely accepted today in linguistics, but there are some caveats. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically what we're talking about is the innate ability of human beings to learn a language. And so let's take a look at this clip and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Syntax, no other animal seems to have it. We have to assume, I think, that something so distinctive, so complex, so much at the basis of human achievement is an evolved capacity.
One term that Chomsky has used a lot is the term universal grammar. And this term flows naturally from the idea that you inherit many of the principles and processes involved in the grammar, your knowledge of your particular language. There are
5,000, maybe more than 5,000 languages spoken in the world. But in fact, what Chomsky noticed is that these 5,000 languages of the world are really very, very similar.
As human beings, we are naturally interested in the differences among humans. We take the similarities among humans for granted. So we're interested in the way humans look different from one another, and their faces are so different, and their sizes are so different, and the way they behave is so different, and so on. From the point of view of, say, some Martian, we would all look alike, just as from our point of view, all frogs look alike. Now, from the point of view of the frog, frogs look, I'm sure, very much different from one another because they're interested in the differences among frogs. We just notice the overwhelming respects in which they're similar. Now, if we can make the leap of the imagination that enables us to look at ourselves the way we look at other organisms, we will quickly discover that we're remarkably alike.
Mine ear is much enamored of thy note.
In fact, the differences, the existing differences among human languages has in this sense been called by Chomsky trivial. Trivial compared with the differences between the human languages taken together and any other system of communication by other kinds of animals, by intelligent machines, and the like. These are all vastly different from the set of human languages, which by comparison are very, very much like each other.
Loma loma na tomba bakalo loma, tiko kina na ve matangali roka, e uasivi e kato toka ko laue loma, isa isa ko loma loma.
So, according to Chomsky, we have this innate ability to put words together to create valid sentences for any given language. This interesting description by Chomsky of the difference among languages is trivial. Well, if you start to learn a language like Russian or Arabic or Chinese as a native English speaker, you might not think that those differences are trivial. In fact, Chomsky went so far as to say, well, all I would need to derive the rules of universal grammar is one language. Today, there are linguists who have questioned the validity of universal grammar, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the idea behind universal grammar is really based on studying a limited number of languages. We know that there are 6,000, maybe even 7,000 languages out there. Only about 10% of those languages have been studied systematically. So how can we say, as Chomsky does, that there are universal rules, that there's kind of a deep structure for all languages, when you haven't really analyzed all the languages that are out there? And so there are linguists today who say the diversity of languages really is such that it's very difficult to come up with universals of language. This is something we're going to be talking about a little bit later, further on. One of the things, however, that is accepted in terms of Chomskyan linguistics is this idea of generative grammar. And this is the idea that that from a finite set of sounds and rules, so we know, for example, in English, there are only 45 sounds, phonemes, and there are a particular set of rules for how sentences are put together, another syntax. From that limited set of resources, there are unlimited, infinite number of sentences can be generated, and the fact that very often in conversation sentences are spoken that have never been spoken before is a good indication, I think, of the flexibility of language. And I think one of the things that's interesting here as well is this idea that's important in Chomskyan linguistics, that the ability to generate those sentences is not a result of hearing structures that a child imitates, And I think this largely runs counter to the fairly widespread assumption that children learn to speak from imitating their mothers. And let's watch a clip that deals with this issue, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
It's the imitation theory versus the innateness theory.
Now listen, I'm going to teach you to say something very important. It might be the most important word you ever learned, okay? And that word is Ernie. Okay? Go ahead, say it. Say Ernie.
People often ask, what's the big problem about a child learning grammar? Doesn't the child just imitate what he or she hears, get reinforced one way or another, and end up knowing the language?
Okay, listen. Here's knee, 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 knee. Now you just say knee, okay?
Our common sense theory about how children learn to talk is that they listen to their parents and they imitate their parents.
But every child, like every adult, can produce brand new sentences that child has never heard before and never produced before.
I hate you, Mommy. Now, come on. You didn't learn this from your mother.
You just have to listen to a 3-year-old for a few minutes to realize that they're not simply imitating what they hear from their parents. I've heard children say things like, "Stop giggling me," or "My teacher holded the baby rabbits," or "My nose is crying," when the child's nose was running, or "I'm barefoot all over."
It's a very funny sort of imitation.
Now, Ernestine, look, watch. Knee, Ernie. Oh, well.
Hi, Ernie.
Hi, Bert.
If we don't learn by imitation, how do we learn? And it's one of the linguist's strongest arguments that acquiring language is different from learning, because we don't seem to learn language the same way we learn other difficult things.
With learning how to ride a bicycle, we all remember being told how to get on it, falling off. We even had training wheels, but we never give training wheels when we're learning language. In fact, what we know is that when mothers try and help their children learn language by making it simpler, the children systematically ignore the information that's being given to them.
I don't know why he says pajamas. I mean jamamas, because I say pajamas, right?
Jaman.
Jamamas? What about pajamas? Can you say pajamas?
Jaman.
We come to cherish our children's errors, rare as they are. They're so cute.
When my little girl would say she wanted to make wee-wee, I would say the word is urinate. Urinate, I said. The word is urinate. Urinate, dear. Right, I'm in it.
We know that some mothers correct their children, but we also know that not all mothers do. And we know that all children learn to speak.
It doesn't seem to matter how many times I correct him. He still says jamamas. He likes that word.
Jaman.
Mothers are important because they provide a lot of the data. Kid makes a noise and the mother expands on it and that sort of thing. But children don't copy what's done around them. They acquire language by being surrounded by it, immersed in it all the time.
I think the common sense view is that the child learns to speak from his or her parents, but as indicated in that clip, children come up with sentences that they couldn't have learned from their parents. And so children get a lot, obviously, of input in terms of vocabulary, from pronunciation, from the environment that they grow up in, from their parents and from others with whom they come into contact. But the idea behind generative grammar is that there is a innate sense of structure that children start with. In that sense, they don't learn language like you learn a skill like riding a bike. So that they're not presented when you're a small child. You don't sit down and study how a sentence is put together, or even study aspects of grammar of your native language. You just acquire it through being around it. It's one of the reasons that in applied linguistics, the field that deals with that, how people acquire language, is called second language acquisition, not second language learning. One of the things that's interesting in that respect is the example of what are called wild children or feral children. These are children who grow up in the wild. There are all kinds of myths of children like that. Remus and Romulus, for example, the founders of Rome. But there have been other wild children. There's a famous example of 19th century Germany, Caspar Hauser, who suddenly showed up in the town of Augsburg at age of 17 or 18 and been apparently living in the woods by himself. And these children who come into civilization late in life have a very difficult time learning a language. Well, how does that relate to this idea of universal grammar or generative grammar? Well, linguists have identified something called the critical period hypothesis. And the idea here is that for your first language, it's important that you be surrounded by input in that language at an early age. So starting from the age 1 or so, going up to the age of 3 or 4, you really need to have that access. And if you don't have that, then it's very difficult later on to learn syntax and to learn how to use a language correctly. So that's kind of a caveat to both universal grammar and generative grammar. We're going to be moving on in our next presentation to talk about kind of a really interesting topic, I think, which is world languages.